let's move quickly I really don't want to do this. There's a whole bunch of regressions which you may or may not believe that suggest that the middle class is, can be a force for good in development. This is work that Norman Loaiza and Gemelli Rigolini did using this new data set, but let me not go into detail on that. There is a lot of literature out there, beginning with Aristotle, and more recently ending with Nancy Birdsall. I should tell her that. You guys should tell her that I made this leap here from Aristotle to Nancy Birdsall. But various people have argued, the middle class is a good thing for development. A bigger share of the middle class, will help. So we wanted to look. We did two things in this more speculative chapter. This is really a speculative chapter. One is we used some data we had, again from the Ecosocial, on the beliefs and attitudes of the middle class. So having looked already to some extent at the objective profile of the middle class, told you something about their education, I've told you something about their family size, their employment. Here we wanted to use these questions about attitudes, and there's a whole bunch of them reported in the book. There's trust in institutions, there's trusting neighbors, there's perception that merit is related to opportunity, there's acceptance of political violence as a legitimate means, and a number of other things. Okay, I picked two of them, but I could have picked a large number of others to illustrate the main finding, which is that there's little evidence of an exceptionalism of the middle class. These graphs, what's reported here is a coefficient on education, so we're controlling for education. And controlling for education, then without controlling for income, controlling for education, put a dummy for whether you are in any of those classes, okay? Yellow is not significant, green is significant. You see no yellows, so they are significant. In some other graphs you see some yellows, but here they're significant. But, being in the middle class just means you have a little more income than if you're vulnerable and a little less than if you're upper class. There's nothing special, it seems, about the beliefs of the middle class. There are some correlations with income for some of these things, which survive controlling for education. Richer people tend to think merit is more due to opportunity than poorer people controlling for education, and the middle class is somewhere in between. They tend to accept political violence less, and the middle class is in between. And that's typically the case for a number of them. They don't all look this beautiful, but that's the general message. And if you put country fixed effects, there are much bigger differences in the countries, across countries in these attitudes than there are across classes. Interestingly, one sort of broad stylized fact is the objective profile of the Latin American middle class. Family size, occupation, education. These things vary little across countries. The middle class in Latin America, defined in these income terms, is relatively similar, more similar across countries than they are from the poor in their own country, in objective things. But in beliefs, that's not true. In beliefs and attitudes, there's bigger differences across countries in the middle class than there are within countries. Last two slides, we speculate that whether the Latin American middle class will turn out to be a force for good in the way that it seems to be in this cross-country correlations globally. We couldn't do this for Latin America because we don't have enough data points, but for the world there seems to be some supportive evidence of this idea that middle class is good for a number of things. We speculate that given that they don't have, particularly benign beliefs, they have beliefs that fit with their education and their income. We speculate that whether or not there will be a force for sort of further development in Latin America depends a little bit on its attitudes, the new attitudes of this new middle class, with respect to an arrangement that we rather grandiosely call the social contract here, which at a very basic summary is the following. Okay? We call it a fragmented social contract, which is that in Latin America, fundamentally, the elite has historically decided to pay low taxes, but then opt out of poor quality public services. Okay? So the idea is, we're rich, we don't pay for very much to the state provides bad education, health, and other services, and we pay for our own privately. Now this is a very, very stark simplification, but there's an element of that. In this graph we have total tax effort, so taxation as a percentage of GDP in a number of countries over time. Here you've got the OECD average. You know, here you've got the United States. There are two exceptions, Argentina and Brazil. Argentina and Brazil tax like OECD countries, and look at the changes. Look at Argentina from 1990 to 2010. Okay, Brazil too, but less sharply. Contrast that with Venezuela, actually, where it's gone down. Okay, so, but Latin America, on the whole, taxes around, you know, less than 20 percentage points of GDP, with the exception of Brazil and Argentina, as compared to 40 or so in the OECD. So taxes are low, and they are skewed towards indirect taxes in most of Latin America. Again, Brazil and Argentina are exceptions. And then just two small examples. I mean, there are lots of examples of this. This is a graph that shows you in different countries the proportion of 6 to 12-year-old children enrolled in private schools by income groups. The poor, the vulnerable, the middle, and the rich. Actually, here we even have the poor. The poor are divided into two groups here. So the extreme poor and the poor. Sorry, so there are five. I don't know why, but so the poor, the vulnerable, the middle class, and the rich. So you see, the middle class are almost like the rich, and the rich basically send their kids to private school. Okay, so public schooling is crap. Send the kids to private school, and we pay low taxes. And there is a nice example as well. That's the share of households in those groups who own electricity generators of their own in the Dominican Republic, where the electricity supply is highly unreliable, I'm told. So even electricity you can opt out of. You know, I mean, you can fix public electricity, but I would just buy a generator. And you know, we know a lot of anecdotal evidence of this with security as well. People live in places where they provide private security for themselves. So the question we have is whether, well, let me conclude here and then I'll ask that final question. So broad messages I've been trying to give you is across generations, in terms of intergenerational mobility, there's little of it. Who your parents were is still very important a determinant of your achievements. And the education system in Latin America is not yet playing the role of an equalizer of opportunities to the extent that we'd like. Within generations, on the other hand, thinking of mobility in terms of directional income movement, there has been a fair amount of mobility, a lot of mobility. Economic growth in the last decade has, A, existed to a much larger extent than it had in the previous decades, and B, been pro-poor. Has had an incidence that was higher amongst the poor, as a result of which inequality fell. So pro-poor growth, growth with reduction in inequality, did lead to reductions in poverty, to a stable, vulnerable group, stable in the sense of size, but there were people moving into this vulnerable group and people moving out of this vulnerable group upwards into the middle class. So the middle class did grow. Although it begins somewhere around the 67th, 68th percentile of the Latin American income distribution. So we're calling it middle class based on that economic security definition, validated by those subjective perceptions, but it's not the median. It begins very high up there on the 68th percentile. Okay. And our sort of concluding thing is this, that lack sort of, you know, if you agree that lack occupies this low tax, low quality of services equilibrium, the big question for whether the middle class will be a fundamental force for change in Latin America or not depends on whether the new middle class, this growing middle class, this middle class that has a good chunk of people that came from a vulnerable situation, will want to revisit that. Will they want a more inclusive social contract, one in which, you know, maybe we try to improve the quality of the public services? Or will it continue to aspire, as others before them did, to be able to buy their own private alternatives and maintain that, that social contract? And that's a question that we don't know the answer to, but we think that whether or not this growth in the middle class will prove to be very beneficial or not may depend in part on how that question is answered. So thanks very much. Sorry for have gone on so long.
Thank you.